Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. I am your host, Tommy Brzee. As always, it is May 13th, and we're going to start things off talking about Urban Meyer and his take on NIL. He was on the Lou Holtz show, and he had some pretty intense words to give about NIL and the way it works in college football today. Then we're going to talk about UCLA and Cal. It sounds like UCLA might be forced to pay Cal a little bit of money over the next decade. Then we have a little bit of talk about NIL, definitely a little bit more interesting talk about just how NIL works compared to how some people might think it works in college football. Then we'll get back to spring overreactions. We'll move on to the Big 12 today before finishing out with a Good Vibes Monday, and we'll talk about that deluxe cover that was released for the College Football 25 game. So 5 segments today. The first time we're doing that, you'll hear a little bit less of me just kind of going on and on. It definitely a little bit better listening experience, I'm sure, but before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun back and forth here, maybe bring up something that I didn't bring up or ask a question that you're wondering about. So again, that's gsmcpodcast.net if you have any questions. But let's jump right in. Let's talk about Urban Meyer. He was on the Lou Holtz show late last week, and he was talking about college football and NIL in college football today. And he was talking about how it's kind of turned into an arms race, and he actually used the word cheating. He said, "This is cheating," and I'll actually give you the quote here of what he said. And he said, if Lou Holtz or Urban Meyer or Marvin Harrison Jr. or CJ Stroud, they want to go out and use their name to help sell cars, help a business, that's great. But to have 17-year-old demand money for a visit, to pay players a lot of money to go visit a charity for 20 minutes and then write a check for $50,000, that's cheating. That's not what this is all about. I'm very disappointed in where it went. And I think this is a sentiment that a lot of people share, right? I think we all look at NIL today, and there is a big time question mark of what are the rules, and given how lenient they are, is this, legalized cheating? And I think there's some validity to that. When you look at the actual argument, is this cheating by the letter of the law? Technically, no, right? We've found ourselves kind of in this area with NIL where there's not a lot that is against the rules because there's not a lot of enforceable rules out there right now. And that's, going back on tons of years of the NCAA not being where they needed to be on this and being just behind the times. So when you talk about when everything was introduced to college football, it was in 2021, and we've already seen all of the changes that have happened. I mean, Urban Meyer was coaching in 2018. He wasn't coaching in 2008, so it's not like he's been out of the game for over a decade, and, the game has totally flipped on its head over, multiple decades. It's flipped on its head in about 5 years, and it's all started in 2021 when NIL was passed. And if you remember how it was passed and how that kind of came to fruition, it was a lot of states getting together and saying, we're just going to take control of the situation. We're just going to pass our NIL laws. We're going to say it's okay to benefit off your name, image, and likeness in our state, and then we'll let the NCAA catch up. And the reality was the NCAA kind of forced their hand in that, where it took them just way too long to get an idea of we need to be paying players at least something. There needs to be a way for these players to make money, and that should have been a conversation, a decade ago. In 2005, when all the stuff with Reggie Bush and USC happened, all of this stuff should have been happening a long time ago, and I'm sure there were conversations, but they dragged their feet for quite some time. I think we can all agree on that, and it became a huge problem. So now we're in a position where you essentially have to smooth over a huge problem instead of one that could have been slowly smoothed over as you kind of go through the rules. And obviously, there was never going to be a world where you introduce something like NIL and you introduce, the world that we live in today, and it was going to be totally smooth, right? There was no world where we were going to have no problems, we were going to have no unforeseen issues or consequences or anything like that. There was a reality where there was a reality where you have rules, you have regulations in place before you fully implement this stuff, and those rules actually make sense. They're not, they can't be tried in a court of law. You can't be sued for them. You can't get yourself into as much trouble as the NCAA has found themselves in with a number of these cases across the NIL landscape the last little bit. So I think when you talk about NIL and, it looks like it's cheating from the outside, it's kind of not, partly because the NCAA has made it to where it's not. There's been this massive push over the last little bit to get common sense rules in place, and obviously that is easier said than done, and there's a ton of legwork involved in that. But the reality is the NCAA, has not necessarily been at the forefront of this in the first place. They have never been, on the cutting edge of player payment or putting players really in the best spot to fully succeed at that level. So I think when we talk about NIL and where it is today, you don't really look any further than the people that, made it really tough to start, which is the NCAA. You want them to have been out in front of this, but we're here now, right? We're where we are, and the question is now, where do we go from here, and how do we kind of curb some of the consequences that have started to happen? Obviously, revenue sharing has been thrown out there, employment has been kicked around, but that one's kind of losing steam more and more as we continue to move on. But I do think there's a world where most of these problems are not necessarily a part of the conversation anymore. And I think it has a ton to do with the people that are in the room for these conversations. I think a lot of us, including myself, are not necessarily enthused by a lot of the people that are making big time decisions in the sport. So I think that's what it all comes down to. And it's something we've talked about here on a lot, where you now have Nick Saban as a retired coach and someone that understands the game probably better than most people in college football right now. You also have former players that understand not only what it is prior to the NIL era, but it's been around for a while. You now have players that are either in the NFL or just, have moved on to other stuff that know what NIL looks like on the inside and understand the going on at each of these kind of programs. So you have people to choose from, I guess is the best way to put this, where in the past, when you weren't giving players a seat at the table, even though you probably should have, when certain coaches didn't get in the room, it created problems and it created where we are today. But there's an easy, or not an easy way, but there's a way to kind of right your tracks here, which is essentially just introduce people into the room that haven't been in the room before. Whether that's, Nick Saban coming into the room and speaking for coaches and speaking for players and being kind of that big time voice, or it looks like a players association where you bring in players to the conversations and allow them to say with their piece, allow them to be honest about what's going on in NIL and what the issues are and how, we can at least start to kind of fix those things. So I think that's the biggest thing in my eyes, where when you look at NIL today and you look at what the future is going to look like with NIL, it's just all about the decision makers. It's all about the people in the room fully understanding not only what NIL is, but the detriments of it and the things that it can do. And you can't really fully understand that if you haven't been in the room for these conversations, which the players and the coaches have. Nick Saban has, all these other coaches that have left the game recently have been in those conversations. So you need those people in the room, period, end of story. And if you don't have those people in the room, you're never going to get a full grasp on this issue. You're never going to be able to pass rules that not only make sense, but are enforceable by law. And you're never going to have enough structure to this thing for it to make sense. And it's a battle that they're going to be fighting for quite some time. I think the NCAA, when you talk about Urban's comment overall, he's right. When you look at this, if you took what is happening today and you put it back in even 2015, people would lose their minds. There would be so many people that would be filing lawsuits and talking about other coaches, and it would be insane in college football. And it's all happened over the matter of 3 years at this point, where NIL was passed in June of 2021. It's now May of 2024, and everything has gone crazy. And so Urban Meyer's technically right. This is, legalized cheating. So I guess it's not cheating necessarily, but it is sanctioned. And it shouldn't be, but that's kind of the reality of the world we live in. And the way that you can fix this is just get a CBA in place, get a players association in place, include some of the former coaches that have been through this type of thing in these conversations, and more than anything else, actually listen to them. There's been this, huge push to have more power in players' hands, but I don't think that's necessarily led to players being able to actually have a say in how that power is actually put into action. But now if you give them a seat at the table where they can come in and say, NIL is a dangerous thing for X, Y, and Z, and I know that because I have anecdotes about all of these different examples, then you can start to work off something that's concrete. Right now, it feels like they're working off, what an NIL could be, what NIL might be, instead of what it actually is in practice. And I think that's kind of the biggest hurdle they're going to have to get over. I do think that this has to be the first thing that checks off the list. I know we look at college football and college sports in general, and we see, a million issues, and we see a million things that they have to deal with. But NIL is at the very top of the list. And I think you'll find that if you check NIL off the list in terms of things that you have to deal with, a lot of that other stuff will get checked off without you really having to deal with it. The transfer portal, maybe even coaches moving around as much as they do. Just the unrest in college sports. I think a lot of that will be handled if you can get a good crystalline structure in place for NIL. But all of that is kind of down the road. I do have faith. I really do. I think it will be handled. I think guys like Nick Saban will get in that room. I think players will get in that room, but the sooner the better, I guess is the best way to put it, because the longer that we let this sit, the longer that we let this kind of world that we've created in NIL fester, it's going to get messier and messier. So I do have faith. I think it's going to get fixed, but make sure that the players and former coaches and everyone that, really knows the sport is in on these conversations as soon as possible, because that could save you a lot of headache and save a lot of kids a lot of headache as well. So we'll continue to get in that throughout the time, but we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about UCLA and Cal. It sounds like the Board of Regents over there at the University of California's university system is very much pushing UCLA to pay Cal a pretty sum over the next decade. So I want to break that down after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Urban Meyer and him calling NIL cheating, and now we're going to talk about UCLA and Cal. But actually, before we jump into that, I do want to remind you all, we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. We get to have a fun back and forth here and, learn a little bit about each other, which is always fun. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's talk about this UCLA and Cal situation, because it has been a little bit of time. It's been about a year since UCLA and USC decided to move on to the Big Ten, and it created a lot of unrest. There were a ton of Pac-12 teams that were very, very upset, And it seems like that is not necessarily ended, at least in terms of what the University of California university system or what they think about this situation. They apparently are pushing UCLA to pay Cal $10 million a year through 2030. So for about, in the next couple of years at least, they're going to be forced to pay them about $10.32 million a year, depending on different circumstances. And this is not ideal for UCLA by any means. When you talk about moving into the Big Ten and you talk about the massive gap that already exists between UCLA and Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and all these other teams that you're going to have to go up against, it's pretty large. And it shows you just how much ground they're already going to have to pick up being UCLA and being in the shoes that they're in. I mean, over the last since 2019, they've accumulated $167.7 million in debt in terms of their athletic budget. So this is the reality of college sports. It's another reason why this revenue sharing, the new bill that is about to come on everyone's table, is going to be pretty tough for some of these people to wrap their head around, and especially UCLA if $10 million of it is going out the door to Cal. And that can actually be adjusted over this next little bit if UCLA goes, I believe, over 10% of their revenue from a previous year. So let's say, or I think it's from this upcoming year. So in 2024, 2025, whatever their revenue is that year, if it increases by 10% anytime between then and 2030, then they can adjust that number from 10 million to 11 million to 13 million, whatever that needs to be. And that obviously is a huge thing for UCLA because when you jump into the Big Ten, you're likely to get a little bit of a jump in revenue and that type of thing. And I don't know if it's going to jump 10%, but it could be a thing that, they end up having to pay more down the line to Cal. And this is obviously something that they're going to fight tooth and nail, and they really, really should. They definitely are not in a position to be losing a ton of money right now. Now, Cal is definitely in less of a position because with UCLA, they're going into a system where they're probably set to make around $60 million a year from that media deal. Cal's set to make about $11 million a year, and Cal actually is not going to get a full cut of that media deal from the ACC for about a decade. Excuse me. So this is something that Cal absolutely needs. It's something that UCLA definitely doesn't want to give up. So it's going to be a very interesting battle, I think. I think one of the things that I was wondering early on, I suppose, when figuring out all of this stuff, and you might be wondering right now, is why is USC safe from this? Because obviously they left with UCLA. Why is Oregon safe? Why is Washington safe? And I don't necessarily have an answer for Oregon and Washington because they both, I believe, are public universities, so that could be something that is coming down the road for the other two schools there. But USC itself is a private institution. They are not a part of the University of California system, so they don't really have an obligation to any other schools. UCLA and Cal are sister schools, as they call it, so they have a little bit more of an obligation. It's the same thing that happened with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, where Oklahoma State was kind of arguing, you either got to take us with you or pay us a good handsome sum. And I don't know actually what happened of that. I don't think that ever really coalesced into anything for Oklahoma State, but it might just for Cal, and that would be an absolutely huge boost for them going into the ACC, where you can make up a lot of that ground that you're losing in taking a little bit of a pay cut with the media rights deal for the next little bit. You can get, another $10 million in your pocket and utilize that as you see fit. So this is going to be quite the battle. I think the big question is, what is going to happen to UCLA throughout this kind of process, because we talked about it earlier, and it's something that we'll likely be talking about for quite some time, is UCLA going into this new era of the Big Ten. I talked about it, last week when I was doing Spring Overreactions. We talked about how Washington might be in a tough spot in 2024. Well, UCLA is going to be in a tough spot in 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, because if this is added to the heap of stuff that is already on their table, it's going to get even tougher. UCLA is walking an absolute tightrope. They're threading a needle when it comes to really competing in the Big Ten soon. And even competing, 5 years down the road is going to be tough, especially when you have to give up 10 million a year and then maybe 20 million in revenue sharing, because if you give up less than 20 million, the people around you are giving up 20 million, and that hurts you in recruiting. So there's so many things that UCLA has to consider over the next little bit when it comes to just what their books look like, because it's going to be a little bit sketchy at times. I won't lie to you. I think UCLA is in a position where they can make it work. All of this stuff can come to fruition, but at the end of the day, you lose $34 million a year ago, and you're adding possibly $30 million to your load over the next, year and a half. It gets really sketchy over there, and you're going to want to put in more money because you're going to want to compete with these Big Ten teams. You're going to want to get more donors and things of that nature, and maybe they can. Maybe they can all get this all together, but their athletic director is absolutely up against it. Martin Jarmond is absolutely battling, and it's something that he knew he was going to have to do, going into the Big Ten, and the increase in revenue and the increase in, talent and competition and all of those different things that get more intense as you walk into the Big Ten. Well, you just got a huge disadvantage where it's possible you're losing even more money to what you already have in the whole comparative to these other Big Ten teams. So it's going to be a battle. It's going to be one of those things that I think you're going to want to follow very closely, because it doesn't sound very, interesting or very, wild from the outset, but it's going to affect both these teams drastically, where, Cal maybe can have a little bit smoother of a landing into the ACC, where they have a really talented team this year, and if they can put it together and, get a couple more donors on the table, plus that 10 million that might be coming in from UCLA, there's ability there to kind of build and grow in a conference that is kind of reeling right now, let's be totally honest. And then you have UCLA, where you're going into a conference that's going to be tougher, that's going to be more aggressive, that's going to be harder to keep up, and then you're getting, caned across the shin. You're getting, kicked in the nuts, where you don't necessarily have the ability that all of these other people have from the outset, and then you just get a little bit more hurt in this kind of process. So it's going to be a fight. I think USC has to be feeling great right now, where you don't necessarily have to worry about this type of stuff. UCLA, obviously, they knew this was going to be a problem when they moved over. They knew this was going to be a possibility, and Cal's taking full advantage, and I absolutely would too. So they have backing from, what you need backing from, which is the university system over there. So I tend to believe this is going to come to fruition. I think UCLA is going to have to pay Cal for quite a while and quite a bit of money. But at the end of the day, I think there could be a reality where UCLA comes out of this and is more than okay. It's just, it might take until 2031 for that to happen, because this is going to be a huge, huge disadvantage as they move into a conference where the disadvantages are already pretty plentiful for them from the outset. But it's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. I think this is something that could be happening more and more as you see all these conferences moving around and teams making decisions for themselves, but maybe not the people around them. Well, they're tied to some of the people around them. So that gets a little bit more sketchy as you kind of go down this road further. UCLA and Cal are the first that I've seen actually come to this point in this conversation, but it could be that many, many more do kind of down the road. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think this is going to be one of those things that feels inconsequential, but could define two teams for quite some time in the Power Five. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. I think Cal will likely come out on top there, but we'll see what happens. But we're going to take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to get back to NIL a little bit, and we're going to talk about how people think NIL works in the recruiting world compared to how it probably actually works, and how things really go about. So want to dive into that a little bit right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more.
GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of action going on with UCLA and Cal. Sounds like UCLA might owe Cal a little bit of money for leaving the Big Ten the way they did and kind of leaving their sister school in the lurch there. But let's jump into NIL a little bit more and talk about the kind of recruiting world around NIL. Every time that I've heard people talk about NIL, they're always talking about the flaws around it. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of flaws. And one of the big things that I've heard, kids demanding money, the transfer portal, leveraging that into getting more money in NIL. That's never the way it was supposed to work. I think we can all agree on that. It's definitely not what we want to see in college football. But when we talk about NIL, I've seen a ton of people make the argument, whether it's, your team just lost a recruit to another big team, or just you see someone like USC or Texas or Georgia or Bama or whoever get a big time recruit, and you say, okay, so they paid the most, or they outbid everyone else, or whatever that looks like for you. I think that's something that sentiment has been building and building more and more as NIL has kind of gone on, and I don't think that's how it works, and I think there's a number of different reasons for that, but I think when you talk about big schools and big brands in general, they're that way for a reason, and don't get me wrong, money helps that a ton at the end of the day, but when you look at the big-time schools in college football, when you look at Bama and Ohio State and Georgia and Texas and all of these teams, they're teams with history, right? They're teams with championships, with Heismans, with moving players to the NFL, which is really what I want to get on mostly, because when we talk about NIL, it's a beautiful thing for the time being, right? It's a lovely thing for, young players to be able to make a little bit of money during college, kind of bridge that gap, make everything more comfortable for them. But that's not money that you're going to live on forever. That's not a retirement fund. That's not anything that is going to get you as far as you need to go in this life. So the way you make, generational wealth is to go to the NFL. The way that you change your entire life and the life of many people coming after you in your family is by getting to the NFL. So you'd be shocked how much that is pitched over, we can offer you X amount of money in NIL, because when you look at the recruiting battles, whether it's, one that was very interesting this past cycle was Dylan Raiola when he left UGA, decommitted from them and committed to Nebraska. There was a little bit of talk that Nebraska was more willing to put up that NIL money up front than Georgia was, and that's kind of come to fruition with a couple of commitments in Georgia and other big-time schools, which we'll actually get to here in a minute. But it shows you the reality of this situation. There are certain teams that are pushed a little bit more to be the NIL big dogs, to pay a little bit more upfront for these players, because you need these players a little bit more. And not only that, but also you don't have necessarily the ability to pitch you'll be able to move on to the NFL and make insane amounts of money quite as much as the big dogs do. So I think when we talk about the recruiting pitches for these teams, there is a lot around NIL, and I'm not trying to say that, when you go to Georgia, you don't hear about NIL at all. You definitely do. But at the end of the day, when you go to Georgia as well, they talk about NIL, and then at the very end of it, they say, that's great and all, don't get me wrong, and we will absolutely help you do that. But that's not what you're here for. What you're here for is to move on to the NFL and make millions of dollars and be in a position where not only are you set for the time you're in the NFL, but you're set for quite a while afterwards, where the NFL has things in place like insurance for quite some time, where college football doesn't, and it's something that they likely are going to have to address in the next little bit with a players union coming into fruition. But You also have pension that can come down the road in your retirement. You have tons of connections to other businesses and ability to kind of go out and do things and make money after your career, and a million other things that the NFL has that college football doesn't have when it comes to making money and making money that, lasts and can get you to retirement and through retirement. So it's a huge conversation in college football recruiting where you look at Texas and you look at Georgia and you look at Bama and you say, well, they have the most money, they pay the most, and that's just kind of the way it works. I don't necessarily think that's the way it works. I think they do pay plenty of money, and they absolutely do flex their muscles in that department, but also they don't need to quite as aggressively, at least from the outset, because you have so many other things to pitch. You have so many other ways to get kids on campus and get kids to buy into your program than waving a big check in front of their face. So I think there's this idea that, the big schools pay the most and that's why they get the best recruits. The big guys get the best recruits because they're the best teams and they're the best place to go to the NFL and to get that money. And now the NIL helps, don't get me wrong, and they definitely have the ability to flex their muscles there as well. But I do think there's this idea that NIL is the end-all be-all, and at some of these big-time schools, that's just not how it works. And it kind of brings me back to the Brian Kelly and Dominic Williams situation that we talked about last week, and I was a little bit critical of Brian Kelly, saying, I think in general, the idea that you shouldn't be paying kids, whatever they want, you shouldn't be bending a knee to every kid that walks into your room, I think that's a good way to go about business, but I felt that the circumstances around their team, and especially at the defensive tackle position, were a little bit too dire to take that into account. I've kind of changed my tune on that, and a big reason for that is I think I was watching Josh Pate, who's someone who I think does an incredible job over at 247 Sports, and he was talking about this, and he kind of went along the same lines as me, at least from the outset, and then at the end said, you cannot let the circumstances compromise what your program is supposed to be. And I think that's something that's huge. The LSU D-line, it's not going to be great this year, period. It probably won't even be good, to be totally honest with you. But it's going to be a problem if you end up paying this kid 1.2 or 1.5, which was the reported amount, and he gets into that locker room and buries you for the rest of the year, because there's a reality where, maybe you play with a bad D-line in 2024 and it loses you 3 games, and that sucks, and you don't want to be in that position as an LSU fan. But there's also a situation where you sign Dominic Williams, you give him all that money, he walks into the locker room and everyone is looking at him side-eyed saying, why is this guy that just walked in from TCU making more money than I am, or making more money than some of the staffers are? And that's a huge thing that you can bury a year by, not taking a kid, and that's and that's whatever. You can bury your entire program by taking a kid and making that wrong decision. So I think this decision by Brian Kelly and by LSU is really just saying we believe in ourselves to not only recruit the position incredibly well throughout the next, couple of years, which is something I think they'll do really well, but also, we're not going to compromise what we do on a daily basis and what our program is and what our locker room is for one guy. And for someone who, fantastic player, Dominic Williams is going to be incredible and help out that Oklahoma team a ton. But at the end of the day, you're putting your program in a position where it could be, I guess the best way to put this, the best way to put an entire bow on this is LSU having a bad D-line this year only hurts this year. LSU compromising and giving Dominic Williams all this money could bury them as a program for the next little bit and could end Brian Kelly's era in Baton Rouge. Period. It could totally bury all of the work that he's done to set up a good culture and to set up a good infrastructure there for players to feel safe and feel comfortable. And it could turn it into a little bit of a toxic environment very, very quickly. So I think it's a decision where from the outset you say, LSU doesn't have the dudes to compete, and maybe that's true, but they could have the dudes down the road, and you could bury yourself if you allow this one instance to define your program going forward. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit more. I think it's something that, from the outset, I was a little bit critical, saying, this defensive line does not look good. And don't get me wrong, it does not. But at the end of the day, you got to make decisions in favor of your program over the team sometimes. And that's exactly what Brian Kelly did. And I think it'll pay off for him down the road. I think it'll make more sense. And I think it'll, give kids a little bit of perspective when they walk into that room where Brian Kelly's not just going to, hand you money. And you're not just going to be able to walk in that room and say, I want $1.2 million, and him say yes. So it not only, helps you in the terms of keeping that program and that locker room intact the way that you want it, but also you kind of weed out some of the guys that you don't want walking into that room, right? You weed out some of the guys that are not in it for the right reasons, or are asking for money, or are pushing. Maybe they just won't take visits to LSU because they know exactly where Brian Kelly stands, and that's a huge part of this. So when we talk about NIL and recruiting and all of this stuff, we always talk about, the big schools, and they pay insane amounts of money, and that's just the way it is, and they outbid everyone. That's not really how it goes usually. All these schools have infinite amount of things to sell before they even get to NIL, where some of these smaller schools, I don't want to name any schools in particular, but some of these smaller schools don't necessarily have that ability to pitch national championships and Heismans and draft picks and all of this different stuff that Georgia and Bama can. So I think that's the biggest kind of misconception, and plenty of big schools do use their money. I mean, we saw Ohio State this past offseason really flex their muscles in that department and bring in a remarkable recruiting class, as well as bringing back some guys that definitely could have been in the NFL right now. So it's kind of it's a fight between two things, where you have these big guys where you want to keep up in NIL and you want to be able to, flex your muscles a little bit because you have a lot of cash to throw around. But at the end of the day, you don't want to, compromise anything within your program. And also, you have just so many things to sell that you don't necessarily need to push NIL quite as much as some people might think you do. So NIL is kind of one of those big arguments and big conversations over the last little bit that it feels like everyone has the same idea. Everyone's not very happy with the way NIL works. Everyone wants it to change. Everyone wants it to get fixed. But everyone kind of has a different idea of how it's utilized in recruiting. And I think us getting on the same page as in fan bases or just in college football overall with decision makers, understanding how this actually works in the recruiting world is super vital to set up good rules and make sure that all of this is set up in a way that makes sense. So it's going to be a battle. It's going to be something that people are watching very closely, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing that I've seen more and more of as we've gone throughout this kind of NIL era, where it's been where Bama gets a recruit and they say, well, that's just the biggest check. It tends to not be totally honest with you, but we'll see that kind of unfold over the next couple of years, and we'll see if that holds true. Ohio State kind of pulled that trigger this past offseason, so maybe some other teams follow suit and they start to do that more and more. But for the time being, it seems like the big-time schools are a little bit less willing to give up some of that money than some of the smaller schools are. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about spring overreactions. We're going to go into the Big 12 today, get to Utah, Kansas State, Texas Tech, and Arizona, and break down kind of what my biggest takeaways from their spring were. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about NIL and recruiting and how it might not exactly work the way you think it does, where big guys maybe aren't paying the checks that you might think they are. But let's jump into spring overreactions, and let's go over to the Big 12. We've done the SEC, we've done the Big 10, so if you want to check those out, they're definitely on the channel there. But the Big 12 is a very, very interesting conference going into this year. You have Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, and Colorado coming over from the Pac-12, and they are going to have a ton to say about this upcoming season, particularly the two teams that we'll cover today and one that we'll start with in Utah. And my big takeaway from their spring is this is the team to beat for the foreseeable future in the Big 12. And maybe it's a little bit of an overreaction. That's what this segment is about. But when you look at Utah, they're coming into the Big 12 with 2 conference titles over the past 3 years. And last year they were without Cam Rising, so what they could have done with him, who knows? I mean, I don't think they would have won the Pac-12 to be fair, but I think they would have been much more in the conversation than they were with Bryson Barnes and Nate Johnson, who actually played some really good football for them throughout the year. But when you talk about Utah, it all starts with that defense, right? That defense is going to be good. It's been really good for a while, and it's going to be good for as long as Kyle Whittingham and Morgan Scaley are in that building. As long as they are in Utah, they're going to be fine on that side of the ball. They might not have the guys that you look in the postseason or the offseason, and you say, that's an absolute dude. That dude's going to break out. That dude's going to be incredible. But they have plenty of guys that play their part, and they do an incredible job developing all these guys and getting the absolute most out of these guys. So as long as those two guys are in the building, as long as those two guys are in the building, as long as those two guys are pulling the strings on the defensive side of the ball, they're going to be more than fine. And I think one of the big parts in this that plays a part not only into this year, but also down the road in the Big 12 is when you look at NIL, there's a lot of schools that are approaching NIL and recruiting in kind of a way that feels a little bit non-sustainable, whether it's, writing big checks or just putting your locker room in a position that's a little bit dangerous like we talked about in the previous segment. But when you look at Utah, it just doesn't really work that way. Kyle Whittingham knows he's not getting the 5-star blue chip guys. He knows he's more getting the 3-star or maybe 4-star guys on his team, and he is more than fine with that. I mean, he got Cam Rising coming over from Texas. He was a big-time 4-star talent, so they use the portal really efficiently to get the right guys in that building, not only from a makeup standpoint, but also, you're not going to get the big-time talent guys, but you can definitely get plenty of talent at Utah, and that's only increasing as they get more talent, as they get, more and more results out there. So you add guys through the portal like Cam Rising a couple of years ago. You added Jaquindon Jackson, who has now found a new place to play, but you added Dorian Singer this offseason. So they've done incredible things in the portal, not necessarily overreaching on some of these players and overstepping their bounds, but playing within what they know and doing what they feel is right for their program. And it just feels like the Big 12 at this very moment has an entirely empty throne, right? There's no one that's necessarily sitting up top. Obviously, Kansas State is the most recent champion of the group in there. Oklahoma State went to the title game a year ago. But there's no one really that has kind of planted their flag, so to speak, in the Big 12. But Utah has every single chance to do that. It could be a rotating cast of teams. It could be Utah just sitting atop the Big 12 for quite some time. So we'll start to find out what that looks like in the fall. But I think Utah is in a position where they can not only be the best team in 2024, but for quite some time in the Big 12. But let's move on to Kansas State here, the team that will likely rival them the most. And I think a big reason they will rival them is because of that rushing offense they are going to have. I think they have the ability to be the best rushing offense in the entire country. When you look at what that actually entails, it's going to be a tall order. There's no doubt about that. That's why this is a bit of an overreaction. But when you look at the ability on this team comparative to other teams where you have the remarkable duos at running back at Ohio State and Michigan and Georgia and all of these teams that are going to be aggressively running the ball. Alabama is going to be an incredible running team. But when you look at Kansas State, I think there's two guys on that team that can make something out of nothing. And then there's another guy that is going to punch you in the teeth. So you talk about Avery Johnson and Dylan Edwards. I think they are two of the best playmakers in the entire conference. You take out Shadur Sanders, you take out Travis Hunter. Those might be the next two guys, to be totally honest with you. I know Fafita is incredible. Tatori McMillan's definitely on that list. But both those guys are just near the top when you talk about playmaking ability, speed, elusiveness, whatever you want to categorize it as. These guys are outright athletes, and putting them on the field is only going to lead to good things. Whether you're getting Dylan Edwards out on the edge, whether you're using Avery Johnson in RPOs and read options and things of that nature, but also when you get into those 3rd and 1, 3rd and 2 situations, you have DJ Giddens, who you can literally just hand the ball to and say, go get 3 yards, and he'll get 3 yards, or go get 4 yards, he'll get 4 for you. So this guy has the ability to just keep drives moving, and that's why when I look at this run game, I just think it's going to be so potent and so different in the styles that they're going to play depending on the running back that's on the field, that it's going to be really hard for defenses to get an idea of what's coming next. Now, the offensive line did take a bit of a hit losing Connor Beebe this past offseason, but the reality is they've been rolling for quite some time there, and they've been replacing really good offensive linemen there for really ever since Chris Kleiman showed up. So I don't necessarily worry about that. I think they'll be more than fine at that position. Obviously, you have Connor Riley, you have Matt Wells. They're going to have a lot on their shoulders to put this in the right situations and make sure that they can, have the rushing attack that I expect of them. But they have plenty to work with, that's for sure. I do think this team is going to lean on the run. That's something that Chris Kleiman has done pretty much since he showed up in Manhattan, whether that's the quarterback running game with Will Howard or Deuce Vaughn being an absolute beast, whatever that looks like. I think that's something that has been his MO for quite some time since he's been there, and I think it'll continue to be that, and even more so this year, just because the ability they have in that backfield running the ball is just out of this world. And so many different sets, so many different situations that all of this can work in. You can put DJ Giddens and Dylan Edwards on the field at the exact same time and have no problems. It's just going to be incredible. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch this rushing attack. I think it has the chance to be the best in the country, to be totally honest with you. But let's move on to Texas Tech, and let's keep talking about the running attack, and let's talk about Taj Brooks, because he is someone that is a little bit under the radar with Ollie Gordon having the year he had in 2023. People didn't talk about Taj Brooks nearly as much as they should have, but I think that's going to change a little bit this year. I do think Taj Brooks has the ability to rival Ollie Gordon in 2024, and both of them have been remarkably productive running backs since they've gotten into college, and Ollie Gordon obviously being younger helps this. Taj Brooks going into his super senior season, he's coming off a year where he had 1,500 yards on the ground a year ago, was really the entire offense for Texas Tech at times last year. But I don't think that'll be the case this year, and I actually think that helps him in kind of meeting the expectations that have, preceded him with the ability that he's shown over the last couple of years. But when you look at this Texas Tech team, you have Caleb Douglas and Josh Kelly both coming in as transfers, Douglas from Florida and Josh Kelly from Washington State. And then you have Micah Hudson coming in as a freshman who is remarkably talented, who will definitely play a part in this offense, will likely start at one of those wide receiver positions. And I think it's one of those things where you look at that team and obviously they're going to be throwing the ball a little bit more often. So that means a little bit less carries for Taj Brooks, which you might think, leads to less yards. But at the end of the day, when you can open up a defense, when you can spread them out, sideline to sideline, but not only that, when you can spread them out deep and make them cover every inch of the field, a lot of lanes open, and they open fairly quickly. So I think Taj Brooks is going to take full advantage of that, and when he gets those openings, he can do incredible things on the ground. So I definitely have full faith in that. The question is their offensive line. When you look at Oklahoma State's offensive line, it's going to be one of the best units in the entire country. When you look at Texas Tech's offensive line, they're definitely relying on some big-time transfers to hit on that offensive line, and I definitely think that'll play a big part in this. But at the end of the day, when you look at what Taj Brooks brings to the table, I think he has the ability to overcome that just a little bit and has the ability to kind of make holes for himself and maybe run through some people and do whatever he has to do. So he has absolutely remarkable ability. He can do things on the football field that are just insane. Obviously, Ollie Gordon is going to steal all of the highlights or all of the headlines going into the season, but I do think Taj Brooks is going to be rivaling him for that all Big 12 first team spot at running back, because both those guys are just remarkable. But it'll be interesting to see if Taj Brooks can put it together and maybe be the best running back in the league, not playing second fiddle to Ollie Gordon. But let's get into Arizona. And this one's not an overreaction. It's Noah Fafita and Tatori McMillan are the best quarterback wide receiver duo in the country. I just think this is true, to be totally honest with you. These two guys essentially share a brain. It feels like everything that McMillan does, Fafita has an exact idea of not only when he's going to do it, but how he's going to do it, which is the huge part in the passing game where you don't only need to know, how quickly these guys get out of their breaks, but how they get out of their breaks and how they run certain routes and how they want to work off certain concepts. So it's a huge hurdle for some groups to get over. It has not been for Noah Fafita and Tatori McMillan. It felt like the second that Fafita stepped on the field, there was just a connection between these two that was undeniable. And it's something that is carried over into 2024. Them sticking in Arizona is as big of a win for pretty much any program across the country this year. Keeping those guys on campus is as big of a win for Brent Brennan as he possibly could have hoped for. So I think Arizona is going to be one of those teams that they had the ability in 2024 to not only, prove that 2023 was not an aberration, but also stick their flag a little bit into the Big 12 and say, we're not only a team that's going to play second fiddle to Utah and to Kansas State and to the other teams in the conference, we're going to be right up there with everyone else year over year. And, utilizing these two is going to play a huge part in that because obviously these are the guys that are the engine of this offense. These are the guys that make it dynamic. Obviously, the big variable here is no longer in Jed Fish's system, so it'll be interesting to see how both of them kind of react to that and see if they can continue that magic that they had a year ago. But it's going to be a remarkable year, I do think, and it might just end in the Biletnikoff for McMillan. I think he definitely has that ability. He will be battling Luther Burden pretty aggressively for that spot, but this group, or this duo in general, is just incredible, and they're going to be one of the best duos throughout the year, and they're going to have a lot to say with what happens in the Big 12. But we're going to take our final break here, and when we come back, we have a Good Vibes Monday for you, and we're going to break down the College Football 25 Deluxe cover. It was accidentally leaked on the PlayStation store, so want to break that down. Very much appreciate whoever put that up, but at the end of the day, want to break that down and give you guys an idea of what we're looking at, who the cover athletes are likely to be, and what I like and what I don't necessarily love about the cover. So we'll be right back after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some spring overreactions from the Big 12. Definitely a lot to unpack in that weird conference this upcoming year. But let's get to a Good Vibes Monday, and let's talk about this College Football 25 Deluxe cover. Someone at PlayStation made a little bit of a mistake and accidentally put it up on their store, and I'm very happy they did because it got around Twitter. A ton of stuff has gotten around Twitter over the last couple of days. You don't really know exactly what is real and what is fake, but this looks pretty real, and I definitely think that it is because EA tweeted something where it sounds like they were not expecting this to be up, but everyone had thoughts, everyone had, gripes or things that they loved, and so I had thoughts, and I want to break those down for you guys right here. But this is a very, very interesting thing, and it's something that we've all been looking forward to for quite some time, and when you look at this cover, it gets you just more juiced up, right? But when you talk about, we've been building up with these cover athletes, and is it going to be 3? Is it going to be 4? It sounds like it's going to be 3, and it sounds like it's going to be those 3 guys front and center: Donovan Edwards, Quinn Ewers, and Travis Hunter. It sounds like those guys will be the ones that have kind of those regional covers that have been kind of have been teased throughout this process. I think those will be released on Thursday with this full reveal that is supposed to come out then, and cannot wait for that. But Donovan Edwards has been the one that feel like a lot of people feel like is a little bit odd or doesn't necessarily belong among the entire group that he's around. But the reality is, when you look at what Donovan Edwards not only did last year, but what he's capable of doing this year, I think it makes a lot of sense. He was the best player in the last college football game that we saw in the national title, where he won the MVP. He scored a touchdown, did incredible things in that game. He is, a part of the team that just won the title, the reigning national title winners in Michigan. You had to get him on there one way or another. Now, that being said, now that they have 3 people, I thought they were going to have 4, given that they have Quinn Ewers on here and they have Travis Hunter on here and every other player that has their name on here is an offensive player, I would have loved to see Will Johnson, or I would have loved to see Mason Graham, or one of the defensive players on Michigan get a little bit of shine here. But when you talk about, marketability, it's the offensive players, and that's just kind of the way it is. So I understand where they're coming from for that. Travis Hunter is another guy that some people were a little bit confused by. A lot of people expected Shedeur Sanders to be the guy on the cover, and I kind of went the way of Travis Hunter mainly because I felt like the SEC had quarterbacks to choose from, and they definitely did. They picked Quinn Ewers in this one, and I was a little bit surprised by that. I went the way of Carson Beck, partly because I felt like next year when, Arch Manning is likely the starter at Texas and is likely in the game, they'd want to utilize that to the nth degree. But maybe they still will. I'm sure they still will, to be totally honest with you. But it looks like Ewers got his shine here. Will get probably his own cover. But that doesn't mean there weren't other guys on here. You see Carson Beck, Jalen Milrose on there. Quinshon Judkins made the cut for Ohio State. Everyone else is, a nameless, faceless character. But it's incredible to see the amount of detail that is being put into this game, and it feels like this is just another example of how much effort and how much time is being put into every aspect of this game, whether it's the calls that are made by Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit, or having different staffs, not only Chris Fowler and Kirk Herbstreit, having different people calling different games, and all of the stuff that is being put into this game. It just feels like the people that are making it have an understanding of what this means to all of us, which I think is a whole lot. But let's get to kind of what I think about, everything else in this, not just the main pieces, but I'll start with kind of the things that I don't love so much. There's not a ton, to be totally honest with you, but then we'll get to the kind of the good stuff that I saw. There isn't a ton to pull from the bad. I think if you were going to have flags in the background, not having Old Crimson as one of the flags is a big-time miss. It would have been a great nod to College Game Day and just what that, it's a flag that I feel like every college football fan knows at this point. Would have been a great addition to the incredible group of flags that they have up there already. Then you have the Notre Dame player to the left of Quinn Ewers. He's wearing the number 2. No disrespect to whoever's wearing number 2 at Notre Dame, but I think that probably should have been number 0, where you have Xavier Watts or you have another player, with a bigger player on that team as the number. Obviously, you're not going to have your name because Notre Dame doesn't do names on the back of their jersey, but having the the number match probably the biggest player on the team in Xavier Watts, I think would have been a good addition. And then, as I said before, a little bit offensive player heavy. But I understand that. I get that's what it's kind of pushing, but would have loved to see some defensive players get a little bit more shine than one guy that plays both ways. But other than that, that's about all bad that was on this thing. I think it's going to be incredible, and I think overall they did an incredible job. But some of the great things on here, it's awesome seeing the names on this jersey. Obviously, this was a very intentional move by them to make sure that people saw it, right? That people understood, they're making sure that all of these guys are in the game. They're highlighting, the different in this game comparative to the ones that, were available 11 years ago or 10 years ago. So it's incredible to see that. Obviously, I think they just about got every single team in. You can see Oklahoma, USC, you have Penn State in there, Florida in there. There's Kansas is somewhere in there's just a million teams represented, which is obviously what you want to do with this. I don't know if they missed a Power 5 team, to be totally honest with you. I'm sure they did somewhere in there, but it's just incredible the amount of detail that they put in and the amount of teams they were able to represent. Also got some G5 teams in there, so very, very cool. every big brand in the sport is pretty much front and center. When you talk about Texas and Michigan and Bama and Georgia and Ohio State, and you see USC, Notre Dame, Oklahoma's right there, and then obviously Colorado being what they are right now, all of those teams are going to be the biggest sellers of this product, right? Whether it's the fans of those teams or just people that follow college football in general, those are the teams that they know. They see, the Longhorn color, and they know exactly what they're looking at. They see the Michigan helmet. They know exactly what they're looking at. Ohio State the same. So it's definitely a great thing to have those front and center, have some of the biggest players with Quinn Ewers, Milroe, Beck, and Travis Hunter all front and center. All of those are super important, and I think it's going to be just incredible. It's going to be one of those things that definitely helps them a lot. And also, when you look at this cover in particular and the three guys that you have in front of you, all three of those guys are not only going to be huge parts of their team, but have a chance to have remarkable seasons where Donovan Edwards could walk out with a Doak Walker Award. Quinn Ewers could walk out with a Heisman Trophy and a national title. Travis Hunter could win the Heisman Trophy. All of these guys have the ability to do incredible things in 2024, and it means, more sales for them. So definitely a great decision by whoever made this cover, and whoever released it. Very much appreciate that. Gave me a good thing to talk about here. But overall, I think they absolutely nailed it. I think there are a lot of people that, are going to nitpick this, but to be totally honest with you, they could have put a blank cover and I would have bought this game 10 times over. So at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter to me what the cover looks like all that much, but this one's really, really cool. It gets me more and more excited about this game. I think when we get to Thursday and we see the other covers and maybe see some gameplay and see some different things from the game, we'll be able to break that down more and more. And definitely, I will be breaking that down very, very much on Friday, I believe, maybe a little bit more throughout the week, just to get you guys a little bit more excited. But we'll see what those covers look like. Maybe it's, Quinn Ewers by himself and just a Texas type cover. Maybe it's an SEC themed cover where you have Quinn Ewers front and center, but you also have Carson Beck and Jalen Milroe and some of the Jackson Dart and some of the other guys on there as well. So I don't really know what those are going to look like. Cannot be more excited to see them. I think this is comfortably the most anticipated game for me in my lifetime. I'm sure for many of you, you're very much looking forward to this more than you've looked forward to anything else. I will definitely be locked in my room when it comes out, grinding out Dynasty mode with UNLV and playing Road to Glory and doing all the incredible things that this game is going to have to offer. Again, very much appreciate whoever made the mistake over at PlayStation for putting this up, because it's just great content, got us all very, very excited, and definitely added a little bit to the show today. So very much appreciate that. We will definitely follow up on this on Friday, where we get the big full reveal. We'll break down all of the different covers and all the different takeaways from that big time reveal that's coming on Thursday. But for the time being, that'll do it for us here at the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, we invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or X, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for content and updates on every single sport you could possibly think of. We have incredible people across every sport doing awesome work. So definitely check out all of the GSMC shows and pages for everything you could possibly need in the world of sports. But once again, thank you for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.